Languages for Data. It's a very nice title. So our colleagues from Clear Global will present on the collecting data about languages as well as collecting data in a language-aware manner. Clear Global, as you know them previously, perhaps as Translators Without Borders, with whom IOM-DTM has been collaborating in the last few years, both at the global level, especially for the DTM and Partners Toolkit, but also in some of the DTM field operations. I don't remember, Nigeria, for example. So very happy to have them here today, and very happy to have all colleagues joining us online, hoping this collaboration between IOM, DTM, and Clear Global will continue to expand even more going forward. My pleasure to introduce this session. We will kick off with the first topic on designing language-aware data collections. You're going to hear tips on translations and information in terms of resources and expertise that is already available and how to access it. This includes about the planning of data collection, language challenges, including translation of questionnaires and hiring of enumerators. Then the second part of the session will talk about data on languages, specifically in terms of why is language a type of information that is useful for humanitarian, key concepts about information on language, what resource and expertise are already available and how to access it, information on languages collected through key informant interviews, DTM MSLA, for example. How can the DTM field companion questions on language can be used, what to consider, how you analyze and visualize data from key informants interview, information on languages collected through household level data, and the analysis and visualization of those as well. And finally, Jason and Guillermo will share with us what Clear Global can do to help, and how to get in touch with them. Thanks again to you both for taking the time to give us this session, and over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for that for that introduction. I think that that sums up fairly well what I think what we'll look to cover in the session. I've got a PowerPoint, so I'll share that, but we'll and I'll talk through that. There'll be a few sort of points of discussion as well as we go through. I'm happy to take questions and so on. I'll make sure that there's a time at the end for doing so, but please do perhaps put hands up or note things in the chat if that's something you'd like to do as we go along, and we can try and address those. So there's a bit to cover, but I shall make a start. So let me just give me 1 second while I just share my get my presentation.
And maybe our colleagues online can introduce themselves in the chat so that Jason and Guillermo know all the DTM staff from the field that is present and from which country. Over.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, thank you. I just want to get the technology right. Okay. Right. Okay, just making sure everyone can we see that presentation all right?
I can.
Wonderful. Great. Okay. Oh, actually, Dania, you might need to, I'm not entirely sure I can see the chat at the same time, so I wonder if I can
I'll monitor it.
You to, yeah, just flag anything that, any questions and so on that might need to come up as I go through. I'll do my best, but it's a bit difficult to see both things at the same time, I think, when we're on this sort of setup. Unfortunately, that's what these things are like. So yes, data for languages and languages for data. So yeah, as we mentioned, the title's really about the fact that there's two aspects to this, but it really things really intersect in many ways. And just to introduce Clear Global briefly, just so that you know where I am, as was mentioned. You may know of us as Translators Without Borders. We are in the process of rebranding to Clear Global, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end about what we do and what we can specifically do in this kind of context. But just by way of introduction, what as an organisation, our mission is to help people get vital information and be heard whatever language they speak. And what that really means is that we are interested and working on language in all its various forms, primarily in humanitarian situations, but also in all sorts of other ways, development situations and stuff as well. So that's why we're here, and that's why we're interested in this, and that's why we're interested in the DTM as well, because we think that this is one of the really key ways that that this issue can be addressed, and that's ultimately really what we're going to talk about a bit today. So just summing up really what we'll cover. So we're going to look today at why language matters for data collection, how to reduce language barriers in data collections, then also how to collect data about language and communication and use and preferences, and a little bit on how to make use of that data. So the so what of doing all that. So I hope that's all good. I hope that's what you're expecting to see. So I'm just going to start off really by talking not so much about why language matters for data collection, but why language matters in general in humanitarian situations. This is a quote that we've had from some of our research to do with Rohingya in Bangladesh. And this really just speaks to how language is an issue that's really at the heart of people's lives and of how they interact in the world, and it's a really key part of their experience, and it can affect everyone, their entire kind of lives. I'm just wondering whether I could maybe open the floor at this point for a little bit before we sort of really delve into the detail of what people's experience of language issues in the course of their work have been, whether anyone's got any experiences where there have been barriers, either personally or just in the course of the work that they do. I wonder if there's any experiences anyone can share that would really give us a good sort of context for the discussion, or any thoughts about that kind of thing. Oh, sorry, I'm just switching screens so that I can try and see that. Give me a minute. Has it been an issue that anyone's faced? Oh, I see I have a hand up. I just think. Sorry for trying to find my way around the.
I don't see any answer in the chat except my own, and no hands up. But somebody commented or liked my comment. My experience, Jason, we put a lot of effort in writing the perfect questionnaire or the perfectly phrased question, very accurately phrased, without really being able then to kind of control the end product, because it's going to be asked in a different question, in a different language, sorry. And so it's, you know, it's very difficult then to know if the meaning that we wanted to give to the question is actually what gets through. Over.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I think that we'll talk about that a little bit when we.
There is a hand up, Hong.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think a lot of times with translations, some of the words that we have the original questionnaire in isn't translatable in another language in the same manner, and kind of tying to what you're saying, it's interpreted in a different way and understood in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's something that we see a lot. Yeah, great. Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah, that's. I think those are really common things. They, you know, in the course of data collection, but also in the course of responses in general and programming in general as well. It can be complicated. It is complicated, but it is kind of fundamental, I think, as well. It's fundamental because it really presents a barrier for people in getting help, particularly in situations where people have been displaced. This is a kind of an example of the sort of experience that people might have, and how language then just compounds those difficulties. So the language barrier compounds and presents an additional barrier to exclusion that people may already be having due to being displaced, due to conflict, due to multiple factors. And it also presents itself particularly in data collections. So here we've got a sort of scenario which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where we're doing a needs assessment, but the people that we're collecting data from struggle to understand the questions and get missed in the data collection and excluded from the accountability that we're trying to achieve as a sector. So again, that's a really common scenario. There's a few really key kind of areas where language can cause exclusion. There's it can be throughout the system, but there's some really key areas that we feel like it can have particular impact on. So basically, access to information and basic services, if those are not provided in the right languages, then that's immediately a factor of exclusion, and that can be things like health, food, nutrition, education, and so on. Having access to information and being able to communicate in the languages that you need to claim your rights and to make informed choices is also really key. Being access to technology, we have quite a focus in Clear Global on technology solutions to language. You know, the technology really is focused on English, and so an awful lot of work that's done that opens up access for people still presents a barrier because of the language that it's in. And then access to participatory approaches and community feedback mechanisms. This kind of if these approaches, these things are not open to the languages that people speak, then we fail to achieve those kinds of things. And this really matters when people are able to express themselves in their own language, that they're not working through intermediaries who are speaking on behalf of them, or speaking in languages which are not their first language. So really being truly open to community feedback and to being to participatory approaches is really dependent on a really good awareness and really good really addressing language properly. Another factor around language that I've sort of kind of already mentioned, but I think is really important and is really often not noted. We talk about language as a factor of exclusion, but the case is, the situation often is that people have multiple factors of exclusion, and language just exacerbates that. So we've got a few situations here where people who may have other factors of exclusion, such as gender, such as age, such as disability. Language compounds that, and in the case, and a good example of this kind of thing is where people, older women may have had poorer access to education, and therefore not have as good understanding of the official languages, the national languages, the languages of instruction, and therefore they are further excluded because of that. So in that way, these factors of having of how gender and age can serve as a factor of exclusion to something like education, then that serves as a factor of exclusion to the majority languages, which compounds the issue of exclusion overall. We've got an example here. So again, these are factors of exclusion. Where these intersect, we get groups of people who face multiple of these factors, and language sits over the top of all that, and people are marginalized because of multiple things. With this graphic on the right here is from work that we did in Nigeria, where men were more likely to speak Kanuri or Hausa, more likely to have more likely to be literate, and that was all due to their exclusion from their inclusion in education. Therefore, when the work that the response was operating in Kanuri or Hausa, men, and age again is another factor in that, had much more access to the response and to information from that. And you know, as we all know, these things are a bit of a vicious cycle. So once exclusion is there, then that can become a factor in data collection and so on. So yeah, so that's, I think, why language matters as a whole in terms of people's barriers and exclusion. I think the work that IOM does in this space is sort of at the start of the process, in order to ensure that responses that are aware of language and are not excluding people because of language. We need to start with knowing about the languages that people speak, and we need to start with understanding what people's needs are, and that's where we start with our data collection. And of course, if people are excluded from aid, from services because of language, then they're also excluded from the assessments that we do that try to prioritize and try to understand what the communities really need. So addressing language in data collections is really crucial. But it is, oh, sorry, I've got some other clicks, there we go. But it is really a big challenge, I think. I think that I was going to stop and ask what are sort of challenges that we face in data collection around language. I think we've probably sort of already addressed them, is that the understanding of the key terms. So from exactly the things that you mentioned before, key terms that are in the surveys, the translation of those can be, the understanding of those can be really low amongst those who are the enumerators who are actually doing the surveys. And once we start at that situation, then we're really going to impact on the quality of the data and so on that we're able to produce. I think some of the challenges that you generally in developing data collections that we face that mean really that we're not able to account for language properly are things like time pressures, budget pressures, and all of those mean that there's not the time, not the resources to ensure that we're addressing language, that we're not able to bring in interpreters or translators. We're not able to really look at the issue of language and how that might affect the data collection. And so we'll look a bit more at some of those issues and at how we might address those. But that's always going to be the challenge. It does take time and effort and energy, but it really impacts on the quality of the data that we get and ensuring that people have are not excluded from those kinds of assessments. So it's really important to make sure that we do address it. So this.
Sorry, Jason. On the last slide. Is that a real statistics?
Yeah. So this was from a study that we did in Nigeria in 2018. Which is available on our website. The words between us, I think, is the thing there. I can't remember exactly the organization it was with. It may well have been IOM, but it was a piece of research that we did where we followed we looked at the full process of data collection from end to end and identified those areas in which language was causing a problem, and understanding how well things were translated and understood. Yeah, it's quite stark, I think, that that statistic. Yeah.
Right, I'm gonna download it and share it on the chat.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, sorry, I think I may have the link at the end of the presentation, but if you can find it, that's great. Yeah, yes, it's a very interesting study, that one. Really delves into some of the detail. So a lot of the things that we're talking about today really are based off research like this, which is looking at how data collections operate. So time pressure obviously is a huge one, and what often happens in this kind of situation, and maybe that you recognize this sort of situation, is where people planning a data collection make an assumption based on their own knowledge, perhaps based on other people who are working in the organization or are otherwise involved, who make an assumption about the languages that they need to administer the survey in. And here we have someone saying that most people speak enough Hausa, especially if they've been to primary school, and that's really good enough. That's great. Okay, Hausa's fine, off we go. But when we start collecting data about the languages that people use, we find that Hausa is not perhaps enough, but we're operating off an assumption, and then we're going ahead and doing our data collection based on that. And so then what happens is we go out and do our data collection. And one of the first things that we do in a data collection is ask for people's consent. Where our enumerators are asking people's consent, which is quite perhaps a complicated concept to go through. We've been really careful about writing our consent statement in English, but what's happening here is that enumerators are perhaps translating that on the fly to people that they're collecting data from. And we've already made an assumption that Hausa is sufficient to communicate with people, but it may not be. There may be groups where it's not. And secondly, there may be groups where people's Hausa is, for example, a second or third language, and we're trying to communicate quite complicated but really fundamentally important concepts to them right at the beginning of our data collection. So we're really, if we're in that kind of a situation, then consent isn't really informed unless we're fully understanding what the consent means. And this, goes back to not planning for language effectively in our data collections. And yeah, and here we go. We're not fully explaining consent, we're not really fully getting consent, which is a huge issue. And then this one really is about when we get into the detail of the terminology. So the terms that we use in surveys are often quite specific, quite technical. And this is an example of the kind of thing where people might, without really fully planning for it, we would just translate GBV. We wouldn't really understand what it meant. We're just translating it as GBV and hoping for the best. Where the other example here is around the word stigmatization. As it gets translated, perhaps it's interpreted as something closer to embarrassment, and that's what enumerators are asking, and that's perhaps not accurate. So those are some of the challenges of not fully working through the language issues in the design of the actual survey. Again, so this is also from the same study. So from 3 different organizations where we went through and we tested their understanding of selected terms from their data collections. So this is something that we do a fair bit of. We call it term testing. And when we have a fairly well worked out methodology for that, It works really well, and it's really important when we're talking about really specific technical terminology. And effectively what we do is we take those terms and we do focus group discussions, we do specific research on those terms, where we identify the challenges that we find, identify terms which don't translate or have been translated wrongly, and come to a kind of shared understanding of what the best way to translate those kinds of things are. So in this example, we've identified stigmatization as being a particular issue, and extremism. Abbreviations are really challenging, and these things can become quite embedded. And then there's some other great examples here. I particularly like the first one. This one I think was from our work in the Rohingya response in Bangladesh. Gender-based violence was translated into violent women, which is, the complete opposite of the term that's intended. And the cause of that really is that gender is translated into women, and once you've done that, then the term becomes violent women, whereas in actual fact it's completely opposite. And the cause really there is that this is a very kind of particular term that in the humanitarian community that we all understand quite specifically, but then when it gets translated, that understanding doesn't carry over and it's not really addressed. And we've got some other kind of examples of that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think those are examples that you'll the kinds of things that you'll probably really recognize really well. And yeah, and if we're not addressing those, then what we're finding is that the data collectors are not understanding the key terms. Consent is not really truly informed. The quality of the data is impacted, because people are either misunderstanding the questions or just answering, not understanding the questions and answering kind of anyway. Just to get beyond it. Also, if enumerators are, if languages questions are being translated on the fly, then that can kind of happen in multiple ways. It can be mistranslated on the fly to the informant.
Sorry to interrupt, but this is a good point, because I've always wondered what is the best practice around translating questionnaires, whether to let that be done by the enumerators when they ask questions, or preparing them in advance. I'm sure you'll touch upon it, and some of the language might not be written over.
Yes, indeed. Yes, so indeed, I think that's actually, let me just skip on to the next bit. And this slide really was just to say the point that in order for us to address those kinds of issues about ensure that language is properly considered, we also need to collect data on language, and we'll get to a bit more of that later as well, but it's kind of like a key part of the step. But I think that the really the interesting thing is about how we can address some of those challenges in the data collection, planning and development and so on. And that's really where it comes down to, is planning and resourcing and paying attention to language when we're designing and planning data collections. So yes, we'll crack on into a few areas where we think that things can be addressed and a few ways in which we think they can. Again, this is just another example, I think, of the ways in which translations between language can change meanings, even in kind of subtle ways that we're not necessarily aware of, and that people can make fairly big assumptions that they are correct. And so that's something that we really need to address. One quick point just before I sort of get on to working through planning around language data collection is that language can be a sensitive issue. And so this also needs to be considered when we're talking, when we're planning data collections. So it can have a relationship with ethnicity, and it can be that related to that. Therefore, it can be kind of a sensitive issue. It can be that people are not comfortable talking their own language in public, that identifying communities of particular language speakers can put them at risk. And so we do need to consider the sensitivity of language as an issue throughout all our work around planning and developing surveys. So that is something to just bear in mind. We'll touch on it a little bit later as well, but there are some, we've done work in the past where we've assessed the risk around language right at the beginning of planning a data collection, and also then right at the end of disseminating the data as well. So I think that's something to just bear in mind as we work our way through it. So I think would everyone sort of recognize these as the kind of the key parts of the development of surveys? Does this align fairly well with what DTM does? Planning the survey, then developing the survey, designing the survey, and then training and piloting it. Are those fairly kind of common stages?
It would be good for people to react so that we know you're still there. It was a fairly easy question. As most of our audience is actually people doing this every day.
Yeah.
So the question that Jason just asked was, is these three stages something that you recognize as your normal way of designing and implementing data collection exercises? Anybody?
Yes, Tonya.
Thank you. Over.
Great. Yeah. Great. Yeah. I mean, I think this is fairly standard. I think even if they're not sort of formal processes, these are things that we the stages that we always go through, from small data collections, from small surveys to really large ones. These are broadly the steps that we go through. And of course, there's dissemination, analysis, and so on at the end of it. So if we start off with planning the survey, the first thing that we really need to do is to gather what information we do know about languages spoken in the area. So often the situation is that there's an assumption about what languages are needed. Without good data, we can't really challenge that assumption. We can't really understand fully what there is. what is necessary, but it's a bit chicken and egg. If we don't have that data in the first instance, then we don't really know. However, there are sources of data. We've got, and I've got some links at the end to some of our resources on where one can find data. And I think also in the DTM landscape, with the opportunity to where we're doing multiple kinds of assessments, that really gives us an opportunity to ensure that the data that we collect informs the next data collection. Yeah, like I said, there's some resources we've got at the end. I would say also that so we need to find out what languages there are amongst the community that we're trying to collect information from. Even if we do have good sources on the languages that they speak, that's great. That really helps us plan data collections well. It is still important to collect the information as we do the collection, collect the information about what languages people speak, because it needs to continue to inform our data collection and our work as well. So, so often there's not very good data. We need to go and find the data that we can, and if there is good data, we still need to continue to collect it. So it's a challenge, but with a little bit of effort at the beginning, we can address it. And then this is really where it sort of comes down to, once we've got some reasonable idea of the languages that we're looking to target, we need to plan and budget for a proper translation of the surveys and into the relevant languages, and recruit data collectors who speak those languages. It's really important that we do both of those things. If we recruit data collectors who do have the languages that we're looking for, but we haven't translated the survey, we haven't come to an agreed understanding of the best translation for those questions, and then we get into all those issues of terminology as well. So those are the key things, and ensuring that that can happen really starts at the planning of a data collection. And here we go. It's finding out the languages that people speak, hopefully from the prior data collection, and then running the survey in those languages. And this really, yeah, is just summing up a lot of things that I've just said. Ensuring that we're planning and budgeting for these kinds of services, and understanding that things can be sensitive, and ensuring that the translations are covering translating the terminology precisely. There's a little bit more to come on that as well. And then this last point, that training data collectors and piloting surveys, really that's how we'll make sure that this actually happens correctly and actually can be addressed. And again, that's all about planning for those kinds of things when we're designing a data collection exercise. So that's about planning, making sure that we've got enough time to do all that sorts of thing. Then the next sort of stage that we'd move on to in a data collection is development of the survey, designing the survey. The first point here is to use plain language in the development of the survey in the language that you're using in the first instance. So, often cases that's English. We've already talked about acronyms, really technical terms. So using plain language in the first case, in the first instance, is really key to ensuring that the questions are clear to both for the purposes of translation, but also for collecting the data in its original language, if that's going to be the case. Again, that's something that we do as a separate, we do as a particular thing, plain language editing, where we can take texts and there's a few really key things to do. Things like removing acronyms, ensuring that terms are spelt out correctly and fully explained, ensuring that grammar and the way things are written is sort of active and so on. Again, you'll find some resources on that on our website, but that's also something that we do as an organisation for all sorts of purposes. But it's also a really important first step in ensuring that the collection is clear and that it can be translated correctly. And then the next step really is to translate the surveys, is to do a translation of the questions and the responses. And again, that's something that Clear Global does. It's something that one needs to really employ translators for. Machine translations, your Google Translates and so on, although they are getting better all the time, and they're something that we as a language service provider and other language service providers will use in the course of our work. They are not really quite up to scratch for doing this kind of thing, and particularly they are not up to scratch for minority languages, for languages which are not the main languages of a country, and beyond the sort of the really large languages, they're definitely worse. And that's something that obviously as an organisation we're trying to address as well. And it can be fairly complex to translate surveys. There is a lot to translate in them. So I really say that to just sort of not underestimate the task of doing that. But I'm really advocating for making sure that you do it. So and then again, include the language questions, which we'll talk about again later, just to make sure that our feedback loop is working. Our chicken and egg situation is that we know what's happening in the next one. And then the next step really is training and piloting the survey. This is really important to do, because it's where all that planning and all that work on translating the survey, on paying attention to the key terms, will come into play. So training the data collectors on the survey, that they have an opportunity to discuss key terms and concepts and agree on definitions and translations. So getting your enumerators to sit down with the survey and check it, to understand what's being said and to discuss that, and doing that in a way in which people can come to a shared agreement is really important, because we'll get different understandings of things. And this is where you begin to identify issues with the translations.
Okay.
Yep.
No, we just lost you for a minute.
Oh, sorry.
You're back on.
Okay, great. Sorry, do shout if that's the case. Oh, and so here's an example of the kinds of things that we would recommend doing in terms of training for enumerators around language. So, looking at the context, making sure that enumerators understand the needs of the concepts, but also things like the specific cultural dynamics. These can have an impact on language. I'm sure these are things that you do to in some degree anyway. And so it may just be the case of making sure that language is considered in this, and that we're doing this kind of training on translations of this of the survey. Also, one of the things is, if at all possible, we want to avoid sight translation. So that's translating things on the fly. But there are cases where that might be the case. And oftentimes we've got a number of languages that we can translate the survey into, but then there are really small minority languages, and if we don't have the resources to translate into all those sorts of things and get the right enumerators, there are cases where surveys will need to be translated on the fly, or if respondents don't speak the language. And those things can be quite specific to the context. And so it's worth having a discussion with those enumerators and with other program staff about what's best to do in that. We want to avoid those things as much as possible, but we do need to have a strategy for when they do, and that strategy is kind of specific to the context. And then, like I said, reviewing the survey in its translations and identifying key terms, making sure that we have a shared understanding of those terms and definitions, and then just how to administer the survey. And so then by that sort of stage, we should have enumerators who have fairly well trained and considered the language issues. But it's also really important as well. This is one of the strategies actually that we can use to verify the accuracy of a translation, is using back translation. So during this phase of training and of piloting the survey, translation back from the languages the target languages we've translated it into, as part of that training, to ensure that the terms that we've talked about are what we expected to see. And this is the kind of thing that we do in our terminology testing. We take key terms and translate them into the original languages. I've just put a link there, but this is also at the end of the presentation, our glossaries, which is the result really of our term testing. And these are things that might be useful to you now, but also demonstrate how the output of that sort of thing. And in those, you'll find particular terms that you'd find amongst all sorts of surveys and so on, translated into multiple languages. And sometimes there's differences in the translations. In this context, it might be this, and in that context, it might be these. Or this is a sensitive term, it should be discussed in such and such a way, and those things can come up with be identified there. Organizing debriefs so that our enumerators after piloting the survey can identify issues, that we can review the data that we get back to ensure that things are accurate. And so debriefing after piloting the survey and debriefing regularly through the process of data collection, and quality checking of the data. And these can help identify where issues around translations might be occurring, and make sure that we can address them as we go through. The gold standard really of ensuring the accuracy of translations and so on is audio recording of the interview. So this is something that can also be done during the testing and piloting phase. Audio recording of the interview taking place, and then subsequently having someone else review the transcript, review and make a transcript, and review and then translate that back into the original language. By doing that during a kind of piloting phase, a testing phase, we can really identify those ways in which an enumerator is perhaps translating or explaining perhaps a term on the fly, and that term not being fully understood, the explanation, the answer, the response is perhaps not fully accurate to the question, and then an enumerator is putting that into a form, perhaps translating it back the other way, or at least interpreting the answer, and really addressing all of those issues by doing recordings and reviewing the recordings of interviews during pilot phases and so on. Really helps us home in on those and identify issues that can then be addressed by correcting terminology, correcting translations, and training enumerators on the way in which they can address those issues. And I think, and this really is just a bit of a summary of how to approach language and how to address language. This really kind of goes for everything in programming and so on in general, but also for data collection. And really, it's that cycle of knowing what languages people speak, planning around it, ensuring that that you've got sufficient time and scope to deal with it, mobilizing the resource for doing so, and using and then implementing by using those properly translated things into multiple languages as necessary, and using plain language as well. And then tracking, and we'll talk a bit more about this, I think, tracking how that how language is or isn't a factor of exclusion. And you can see how this can be applied to, the cycle of a data collection, but as much as it can be to the cycle of a program. I wonder if I'll stop there for a moment to see if there's any questions or thoughts on that, on addressing language in data collections, before I sort of move on to more of because the next section is really about collecting that data about what languages people use. So I wonder if there's a good point to stop for a bit of if there's any thoughts on that, any questions and so on.
Does anybody have questions or wants to share a challenge that Jason has not spoken about?
Yes, always interested to hear if there's things that people have experienced that they don't feel like these would address. You know, it's always something we're interested to hear.
I mean, I don't have a question, but I always found that the translating back the survey is a good way. Andrea, go ahead.
Sorry, Donny, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just had a question in terms of whether there is any support that teams in the field can get from Translators Without Borders. For example, as we're saying, when recruiting translators, is there a database? Perhaps I missed this, but is there a database of existing translators that can be recruited? Can Translator Without Borders help us identify specific people that can help with this? I remember when I was in South Sudan, we tried to do translations and back translations, and the results were often pretty dismal. So we, at some point, had to scrap it because we just couldn't get to a version that captured something. And at some point, we decided we were going to trust our enumerators and focus on the more the discussion and the piloting and training. And really trying to make sure that they understood the concepts and then letting them put it in words as they preferred. Because if we tried to put it on paper, it just wouldn't work. And partly because many of those languages weren't languages that people really would write. Some of the local languages in South Sudan do have a written form, but this written form is very uncommon and it's not taught in school. So people are able to speak the languages, but they can't really write in it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I think some of the things that you did there, like, were things that we discussed about ensuring that there's an opportunity for the enumerators to come to agreement on terminologies and so on. Translators Without Borders offers translation services. We offer and the model that we have is that we have a community of translators, because our focus really is on minority languages. We really try and target those languages, which we do oftentimes through members of the diaspora. Minority languages are always a struggle to find good translations for, and we struggle as much as anything, but it is one of our areas of strength relative to other kind of language service providers, that we target these languages, and we target it by looking for members of those communities. So that is something that we offer, and we do sort of various partnerships and different ways of doing things. And so that's something to get in touch about. We've done plenty of surveys. I'm not sure. I certainly haven't seen a DTM go through that process, but I've certainly seen MSNAs and things like that go through that process of translation where we offer that service. There's also a few resources, like things like glossaries on our website, where we have specific terminology. So some of the language questions that we'll come on to, we have translations for already there. But obviously, you know, in most cases, surveys are tailored very specifically to the context, and they require a translation to do that.
Jason, there was an initial question that was on the same line around support. I know you're going to talk about support at the end, but maybe just to let you know, Cynthia, the beginning said that in Brazil, IOM translated the Brazilian government's demographic census questionnaire, and which collects information for 213 million people. And because of the time, it wasn't the best job possible. It would have been fantastic to have support. you know, in terms of support available either now or later, if you want to address options as well, how to get in touch, for what to get in touch. Again, when you want to do it during the presentation, you have another 50 minutes for this.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit at the end as well. But yeah, broadly speaking, it's get in touch. But I will direct you to the right place to get in touch. But that is something that we do basically offer. So yeah. Okay. Great. Any other kinds of issues and stuff in data collections that people have experienced that we want to talk about?
I haven't seen anything in the chat, so maybe we can proceed, and then if people write, I will definitely find the time to interrupt you.
Great, do so. Okay, so as I've mentioned, one of the things in order to make sure that we are properly addressing language, both in terms of data collections and in terms of responses and programming and so on, is knowing the languages that people are using, and so it's of real importance to be able to collect that data about what people are using, and to be able to do that in a way that can inform the next collection, the next piece of programming, and so on. So there's a few reasons why we really advocate quite strongly for including it in as many data collections as possible. Firstly, that data about what languages people use is surprisingly poor. We do, and you'll find on our website, we regularly, one of the things that we're working on is really trying to address that gap. And that gap is because either the data doesn't exist or the data is fairly inaccessible. So we're talking about things like censuses or other kinds of data collections, assessments, and so on, but that they are they're difficult to access, difficult to work with. And so the work that we do oftentimes is we advocate for collecting more of that data and work with people like IOM as much as possible to advocate for that to be collected. Then when that data is where we can access that data, we analyze and publish maps and visualize and make that data accessible and useful to people. And on our website, you'll find a bunch where we have done that based on census data, based on all sorts of other things. We've also done this review, which is a global language data review, links at the end as well, where we've been through not all countries, but priority kind of countries, and assessed what the quality of existing language data is. And you'll see here on the map that you know, while some areas are good, there's a lot of variation, and that there are we got 24 countries out of the 88 that we assessed had poor data, either in terms of its timeliness, its quality, its accessibility, or so on. So in a lot of places, we're already starting from a point at which we don't actually know very well what languages people are speaking. And anything that anyone can do to add to that understanding is always going to be useful. And the effect often of that lack of hard data or of good quality data is that there are some assumptions about what languages people are speaking. This is Central African Republic. We did this off the MSNA data, and we presented this back into the as the results of that. And there was quite some surprise about the fact that Sango, which was assumed to be effectively the main language, that was going to be sufficient for communicating with people in, and the assumption was that it was basically the majority language everywhere. But actually, that we found, and you'll see some of these areas in where it's lighter, where it's actually not the majority language. Overall, for the country, it is the majority language, but in particular areas, it's not. And so, therefore, relying on Sango in that in those areas is not going to work. So a lack of data leads to an assumption, leads to people working on the basis of that assumption, and collecting the data can kind of overturn that. This is also another example about why it's important to collect it as much as possible, even if there is kind of existing data. This one is from a couple of years ago. We've had a couple of MSNAs in northeast Nigeria where we've been working for a few years now. In actual fact, there's also now in northwest Nigeria where this is from an MSNA, so one that Reach Impact Initiatives ran, and they've done the northwest one as well, based on this kind of learning that primarily before the assumption was that there was two languages, Hausa and Kanuri, and that this was kind of the map on the left was the distribution of them. But in actual fact, when we start collecting data, we can see that there's a much wider variation, that it's a really complicated mix of languages, and yeah, it is particularly challenging in that context, but it's often kind of relied on Hausa and Kanuri, and that's not quite the case. So we also, and we'll look at this a little bit later as well, but we also look at language. There's a number of other questions that we recommend about to ask people about the ways in which they're communicating, and we can see in those that there's a variation in the ways in which people are communicating relative to the language that they're speaking. So again, this one is from Central African Republic. We've got quite a complicated mix. This is about the channels to receive information in. Obviously, it's dominated by Sango speakers, which is this dark blue here with an enormous amount of smaller variations. But we've got some really standout areas where we've got different languages, like this Gabaya here, much more prefer film and newspapers, and Shuwa Arabic speakers, I think that is down here, are looking for getting information from their religious leaders. So we get quite a large variation amongst those, and that can be really important for the next step of programming and data collection. Another layer of information that we collect about language use is about the preferred language for written communication and preferred language for oral communication, and there tends to be a surprising variation in that. I think, as we already noted, sometimes languages are primarily oral languages, and therefore asking people what's their main language of communication is the best thing in order to understand the best ways to be engaging with them in something like a data collection, but that's not the best way to communicate with them for written information. So understanding those next levels, those nuances. This one is a bit of an analysis again from one of the MSNAs, I think Burkina Faso. So the 83% of the respondents wanted to receive, and this is actually oral information in the same language as the main language spoken at home, but actually 17% wanted to receive information orally, but in a different language to what their main language was at home. So there's clearly some kind of differences there in the ways that they're expecting to be able to communicate with people. So understanding those nuances takes a bit of detail, really. Actually, there's one more which I might just oh, we'll come to it later, so that's okay. Similar kind of issue. Oops. Oh, sorry. Oh no, I have hit the right thing. So, so yeah, I just wanted to talk through. Actually, just to sum up that kind of point, there's two ways in which I think that collecting language data is really important. One is that understanding of the languages that people need to communicate in. The other area is, and this is why it's important to be able to do it in the data collections that you're actually running, rather than necessarily relying on knowledge from other data collections about what languages people speak. If you include those questions about language and communication preferences, you can use that data to compare and correlate with other questions in that survey. And you can then start to see where language is a factor of exclusion or presents barriers to people's integration and access to things. So if you, I think that collecting the information about language is a kind of a demographic issue. We need to understand the community that we're looking at, but we also can use that to identify marginalized groups and exclusion, and we can only do that if we've got that question about language in the survey with all those other data points as well. So yeah, even when I'm asked, when do we prioritize when this is useful? Surely we already have this from, you know, an MSNA or a census or something like that. It's not, or we did it in last year's one. I always say it's still important because you can still find, you can still look at marginalized groups. So yeah, so I want to sort of bring this back to the DTM field guide questions. I've been talking to Dania a fair bit about the questions that are in there. And we've talked about that prioritization issue. And so the questions that we've got in the field guide as it is currently, Dania, maybe you want to.
Sorry, just to say, Jason is referring to the DTM Field Companion, yeah, which we have had for a while. It's okay, it's just a number of different titles. So the DTM Field Companion for Languages, we have had that since the beginning. We worked on it with Jason's colleagues. However, we also have seen that through feedback, some of the questions were not really appropriate. Some of the indicators were not what people really needed. So we have revised it, and we are in the process of uploading it to the toolkit. And we also need to include them in the data dictionary, modify the ones that exist in the data dictionary to give you probably the best, you know, suggestions around the questions. They're all optional questions, of course. Those are not core questions. However, they are questions that are of interest of many partners. So it is a good practice to include at least the first three, and then we'll see with Jason. So it's highly recommended that we collect that information, then throughout at least one of the iteration of the MSLA. So I'm going to pass in the chat the latest version, the one that will be up on the toolkit, but you have it in advance, so that's very exciting. Over to Jason.
Yeah, and there's plenty more detail in that, obviously, and so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I am just going to sort of briefly discuss the questions that are in there and kind of why they're in there. The main language question. This is kind of the main language question in this, both in the sense as it's the main one that we think is super important to include and should really be included in any collection, but it is also the question: what is the main language spoken by what population group in this location? We recommend fairly strongly for a single select option as the response on this. It can make it very challenging if we get multiple, challenging to analyze if you get multiple selections. Providing the right selection list is also important, and that also needs to be kind of planned and designed for. We have a list on our website, but if you're also able to use any previous collections, then that's important. And what I mean is the list of languages that people are going to select. Also always including an other option so that you can kind of expand that list, but also reviewing and moderating that. There are plenty of instances where languages have multiple different names depending on who you are and so on. And so again, it's important to ensure that that is considered within the planning, the design of the survey, and that you're including the right options in the list. Like I say, we've got a starting, we've got a list, but it's kind of a starting point, and it should be reviewed. The reason I say single select, and it's a challenge in this situation where we've got, when we're doing key informant interviews about an entire community, obviously the best is for us to be able to do individual surveys and then aggregate the data up from there. And in that case, the question that we recommend is, what is the main language you speak at home? Household level surveys are another step away from that, but still sufficient. KIs is difficult because we're asking about an entire community, and what the things that we're trying to find out are, what are the main languages that we should use to communicate with this community, but we're also looking for those people who are excluded because of language and who are minority language speakers, and it makes it quite challenging to get to that. But that has to be balanced with the practicalities of asking many questions about languages. How many of this, what's the most spoken language? What proportion of people speak that? What proportion of people speak the other? There's lots of things that we could ask to get a really fully detailed view of it. So what we've landed on as a sort of pragmatic point is the really core one of what's the main language spoken by the group in this location, but also asking what are the second and third or other languages spoken by the groups in this location. We're not going to get really good data on the proportions of people speaking those within each of those, but we are at least being able to identify the most common ones and identify all those languages that are there. So I think it's really important to be asking, certainly the first one, the second and the third and other languages as well, I think is also super important. More details in the field companion that Dania just shared. Yeah, so that's the kind of the key one. I don't know if anyone got any sort of questions or about how that might be used and incorporated. I shall move on in that case. So yeah, as already mentioned, that it can be the case that that there are nuances and differences in the way that. Yeah, go ahead.
And I got kicked out of the meeting. Yeah, no, it's not that I have a question, but I wanted just to clarify to your colleagues. So we have these three questions that Jason just presented. Can you go back to the slide before? Yep. So these are questions on the data dictionary. Sorry, on the DTM field companion, and they will also be included in the data dictionary. The first question we're going to ask to three times. First main group, second main group, and third main group. Those are the first three questions that I was mentioning before. And also, when we're looking at the next slides, you will also find other questions that are also in the data dictionary. Apologies if I said what you just said. I just wanted to make sure it was said. Over.
No, absolutely. No, thanks for clarifying on all that. Yeah, you know much better the process of the thing and how people use it. We've spent lots of time discussing the questions themselves, not so much how they get used. So yes, so there's other questions in there, as Dania said. So we've got a couple more that I think are sort of also important, the next level down, trying to get an understanding of the languages that it's most useful to communicate with that community in terms of being able to provide them with information. This is some of the key things. As I say, it can reveal the fact that there are nuances between the main languages that people speak, but actually the languages that they expect to receive information in. The other areas that we think there's a number of ways we can look at this by looking at the data that we receive, comparing main language to various other access issues and so on. But to really understand the barriers that people face because of language, it's important to ask these questions about what the barriers that they face. I think it's particularly important if we've identified perhaps in a previous iteration that there are language groups who are excluded by doing analysis on our previous set of data, then we might on the next iteration of a data collection want to go back and understand more fully what those difficulties are and why. So these recommended questions here are about asking about the difficulties that there are because of language, and then asking what particular groups, so homing in on those who are being excluded because of language issues. Yeah, there's so those are the ones that are in the field guide. I think that's the field companion. I think that's all of them. We also on our website, which is at the bottom here, and I'll again send you all the links and so on. We have a number of versions of questions as well. That's what these ones are based on, but there are others there as well, and there are other versions of them for individual surveys, household surveys, and so on and so forth. Also, we've got them formatted in COVO format, and we've got the list of languages as your option list, and in some cases we've got things translated into various different languages. So so you might find that there's also some useful resources there. I'm sure Daniel will want you to first go to the field companion, but you might want to also look in that spot as well. Yeah, and that's just some of the examples of the things. The other things that I just wanted to mention, I think is important, but I think this is probably fairly standard for you, is that these are the kinds of pieces of data that I go looking for when I find a data set and I'm looking at the language. Then I'm going to look at the ways in which that is, you know, the other variables that I might compare things to. These are the kinds of things I'm always looking for: geographic distribution, for demographic kind of distributions, and for how language affects communication and accountability, and access to assistance services, distribution, so on. But I think these are the sorts of things that are commonly in DTMs, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's the language questions. I've just got a short bit on how to use that and how to analyze that. And well, how to analyze it, and then how to make use of that that information. I'll just stop in case there's any more questions on the questions at this point before I crack on with that.
Nothing that I can see. I just wanted to highlight what you just said, that you have additional types of questions that you recommend that are not done through key informants, but household individuals. So that's the link that you just had on your previous slide. And that is important because in many cases, DTM is also doing MSLA and other, you know, household level interviews. So those questions are available. Go through that link that I will pass into the chat. Over.
Great. Great. So yeah, I just want to sort of highlight a few things about analyzing the data. So I talked about this before in some ways. One of the main, the first step that I always look for is about understanding the languages that are in use before I start looking at any kind of other aspects of marginalization or anything like that. There's a number of ways to do it. It sort of rather depends on the data that you get. So here's two examples. It also kind of depends on what you find a little bit. We often map things because there's often a geographic distribution to the language data that we get. It can be very much multi-layered because you've got a number of different languages spoken, different proportions of people are speaking them. So mapping is useful for identifying that that geographic distribution. This one on the left, I think, is the same one as I showed before. It's about the proportion of Sango speakers. It doesn't then talk about the other speakers, but I will. This is actually part of a dashboard where you can select the different languages, and so you can go through all the different languages and see where those where those are spoken. And I think I might have it coming up later on. The other really key kind of map visualization that we often do is the most common main language spoken by district. What you find there is that where we'll identify, so we might identify Sango as the majority language in a district. Where in another district, it might be another language. There are also then minority languages underneath those, and so being able to represent those, oftentimes to do it geographically is one way to look at it. And so we'll present a couple of maps, but we'll also present some charts, which are more on the actual languages that we find in there, because then you start to see some of those more minority ones. This one is from, the one on the right is from the Somalia MSNA of last year, but I was just doing some work on it. In this example, I've looked at the disaggregation of the languages by different population groups, and so there's a useful finding here in that Mai and Benadiri Somali speakers are much more common amongst the IDP group than overall and relative to the Northern Standard Somali speakers. This data set had a relatively few number of languages. Often we end up with much longer lists of languages, but you can, by charting it in this kind of way and looking at those comparisons between different other factors, you can identify those kind of communities within your data set that might be geographically or based on some other kind of category. So that's the first step that I do, is always thinking about who's speaking what, who's using what. And then the next thing that I'm looking for is how language can be a factor of exclusion. And there I'm looking at what other variables I've got in the data set that might be that might reveal something about communities who are excluded. So for example, this one, again from the same MSNA, we've got a question about were you, in the last 30 days, I think it was the question, in the last 30 days, have you been denied access to humanitarian aid? If so, why? What was the reasoning for that? And by disaggregating that by language in this kind of way, this is the one that really you want to highlight, is this minority clan affiliation for my Somali speakers. So the reason that they were denied aid, their perception was that it was to do with their minority clan affiliation. That is much higher amongst my Somali speakers than it is amongst Northern Standard Somali speakers. So that's just one kind of relatively simple view of that, because we've got only relatively few languages. But identifying those questions in your data set which talk about access and exclusion, and then disaggregating that by language and considering how there are differences between the different languages can really identify those issues. And there's a few more examples and so on, again, on our website of reports and so on. This Somalia one, we're about to put out a briefing on that as well, which may or may not quite yet be on our website. It's based on this kind of analysis because of the food crisis that's occurring there at the moment. Yeah, but then once we've been through the analysis, we're talking about dissemination. So just a couple of issues to consider really in terms of dissemination. Considering language data to be sensitive, so it's sensitive in the same sense as any other kind of demographic kind of information. And so you want to consider the level of risk that publishing that data might present to a community, because it might identify particular communities. And what we do before we go through publication of any kind of maps or data sets, even if the data set has already been published in some form, we're going to present it in a new way. We go through and consider the kind of issues around the political context, around ethnicity and so on, and we do a formal review of that to decide whether the risk is to consider the risk of publishing that data set or that visualization. And we have then either made adjustments or not published things because of the risk that we identify. One of the strategies is making sure that things are aggregated to the right kind of level so that, you know, obviously individuals can't be identified, but potentially small communities that could be targeted, you know. So we always aggregate stuff up at a geographic level or at some other level. And also then obviously data protection stuff, which I'm sure you are all well aware of in these kinds of things. I'll just quickly rip through this and then we'll have a bit of time. So the question then obviously that people ask is then what does one do with this? What are we trying to achieve once we've collected and analysed that data? Again, comes back to the main kinds of things, making sure that people that planning and around all the other elements of humanitarian responses are aware of language and are based on good evidence about what language people need to use. So that's ensuring that planners and decision makers know about languages and the ways in which there may be differences between or preferred channels and so on. And then, you know, making sure that that then informs programming, informs feedback mechanisms, making sure that these are all available in the right languages, and data collection. So the feedback loop comes back to those. That's usually relatively, or it's easy to identify the key languages that you need to do that in. What's always challenging is that there are always people who are speaking minority languages in those data sets. And it's difficult to be able to identify, to prioritize those amongst everything else as well. Where I'm often asked, what is the 3 main languages that I should use in this piece of information or programming or whatever in this context? And I can always say, well, it's these 3. But there's also all these other people who you won't reach if you're not doing stuff in those. But there's obviously a prioritization issue. So there's that, and then identifying marginalization within your sample, what factors there are of that, and that really ensures that you can target resources to those factors where particular groups are marginalized because of language. So this is where we might have minority groups that they're marginalized in particular access to particular kinds of services. So in this kind of an instance, we might consider directing some resource to ensuring that that service is available in that language for that minority group. So again, doing that analysis is all about prioritizing and informing what can be done, what services should be doing with it. And this is just an example of when that's this is the example of the kinds of thing that we're trying to address really by doing that. That guidance, information, tools, everything tend to be done in one language. If we're not really highlighting this issue, then people out in the field or affected communities are struggling against translating things one way and back to the other and losing things along the way. Yeah, so that's really the end of it, apart from just to let you know about Clear Global and how to get in touch and where all the resources are. So I don't know if this is a good point to sort of stop and ask for any more questions or thoughts or anything, because that's kind of about the end of the information that I've got to present, but yeah.
Jason, while people are thinking about their questions and coming up with them, can we start answering more specifically those 2 questions around how you can support, how can we get in touch? what type of resources and commitment do we need to make? You know, because the global doesn't have core funding, right? Over.
No. So yeah, there's how Clear Global can help. There's 3 bits to Clear Global, but you can get in touch with us for all of them. The first bit is Translators Without Borders. So this is our language services. So this is providing translations and so on, using that community of translators that I talked about. We also have Clear Tech and Clear Insights. I'm in Clear Insights, where we can offer analysis services. Clear Tech is all about language technology and building things like chatbots and so on. I think that's probably super relevant. But the translation part, we have partnerships. We're not core funded. There are costs to doing the translations, but we have a number of different levels of partnership. From kind of individual one-off sort of items to longer partnerships where we can provide services up to a certain level over a long period of time and so on. I think with some organizations we have a kind of global agreement. I don't think that's the case with IOM. We have worked with different elements of IOM in different ways. Oftentimes, what we end up doing, that's why I don't think that there's some sort of global agreement. I think that we were doing different agreements for different projects. Oftentimes, we end up working on a project which is a package of things that involves translations. It also involves our support to helping design the survey, review the survey about questions about language or something like that, provide training to, actually I think that's on my next slide, training to enumerators, or do some of that kind of analysis and visualization. We did a project in Iraq with IOM where we did analysis of, there wasn't a DTM happening, which was unfortunate because it would have been great, but we did some analysis of data that was collected. We also did some terminology testing, and we also did some translation, straight sort of translation work as well, you know. And it's often good to be hand in hand, because we can do the survey work and the analysis of the survey, and then identifying what the key translation target languages are, and ensuring that things are trained in the right way. So yes, you can get in touch here, and I'll post these in the chat. These are some of the resources that I've talked about today, and my contact details. Don't worry about writing that down. I'll post all that in the chat, and I will also just find the link for where to go to for translation services and translation partnerships. You could come to me, and obviously, but I'll be passing you on to somewhere else, so I'll find the direct route for that as well as we talk.
Super great. And then maybe Jason, you can share the final presentation with the resources and the email of the right department for translation, Translator Without Borders.
Yep.
And then we can send that all in an email as well, so that people have it handy when they need it. And I'm happy to forward that email to all the participants.
Right. In actual fact, I think I don't have. I'm not sure I have the chat. I can't find the chat button anyway, so might need to be in that way.
Right, let's do it in that way.
That might need to be that way anyway. Yeah.
So we do have a few more minutes. I would invite anybody who has a comment or a question that wasn't addressed. speak now. Or write, if you prefer. And maybe while they do, Jason, I have a question. What's the turnaround if you have, you know, if colleagues in the field need help them with the translation of a survey or a questionnaire and so on? What would be a turnaround for that?
It can vary a bit. The factors that make it vary are obviously the length and the complexity of it, and the languages, the number of languages, and the type of languages that we're looking to translate it into, and how sort of technical kind of the content is. What is, when you request a translation, there's a project manager who works through that with you and gives an assessment on the turnaround time. I wouldn't like to commit too much, but like I said, depends on the number of languages. I am trying to think about that MSNA that was done. That was into fairly languages that we have fairly decent resources on. I think it was a week, that one. But yeah, I wouldn't like to commit too much, and it can vary kind of hugely. We also have fast turnarounds on things and so on as well. So yeah, it's certainly worth talking when you're asking for it.
That makes sense. Okay, but somebody, you know, when you start talking to somebody from Click Global, that would be part of the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll be able to give you an assessment based on exactly what you've got. But yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't want to keep people here if there is no more question. I don't see anything coming up. Has anybody somebody wants to talk without writing? Just take the mic and ask a question. If we have forgotten anybody, or okay, I think then we can close here. Jason, thank you very much, and thanks to the participants. I hope this was useful for everybody. I think that's a lot of information and a lot of resources, Jason. We are just going to save the recording and share it with people on the participants, as well as all the other information that you will share with us in an email. And again, thank you, and looking forward to continuing this collaboration. And people are thanking you in the chat as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Great. Thanks for coming, everyone. And thanks for the opportunity.
Take care.
Yes.